From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. I am your host today, Dr. Kelsey Norman. In today's episode, we will discuss how recent attacks by the Yemeni armed militant group, the Houthis, against commercial ships signal new tensions are escalating in the Red Sea and the broader Middle East. I am pleased to introduce my colleagues, Dr. Mohammad Tabaar and Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen. Before we move into the discussion, let's talk about the current landscape and how we got here. The Houthis, who are backed by Iran, have warned that in solidarity with the Palestinians, they would target any ship that carries oil or other goods to Israel. On November 19th, the Houthis hijacked a cargo ship that had links to an Israeli company. On December 12th, they launched a missile attack against a Norwegian tanker whose owner has denied it was bound for Israel. U.S. forces in the region have shot down several drones launched by the Houthis. These events show that there is a possibility of a broader war in the region and that the conflict between Israel and Hamas could still escalate beyond Gaza. Mohammad, Kristian, any initial thoughts?
First of all, thank you, Kelsey, for hosting this session. I look forward to this conversation with you and our colleague, Kristian. So I think it's a concerning situation that's been unfolding in the Red Sea and the Strait of Bab al-Mandab. As you mentioned, I think we're witnessing what could potentially become a new center of conflict in the already volatile Middle East. The Houthis survived the Saudi bombings that started in 2015 with the strong support of the United States and continued until last year or so. Not only they survived, in fact, they emerged as a formidable military force in Yemen. But these recent actions go far beyond Yemen and Saudi Arabia. They target Israel, as you mentioned. It's a significant escalation and a strategic move that takes the Houthis' missile and drone capabilities to an entirely new level. So far, nearly all of these missile and drone attacks have been intercepted by U.S., Israeli, and French forces in the region. But these growing attacks pose a serious challenge to Israel's economy and security. So many Israel-bound ships that come from Asia are now going around Africa to reach their destinations in Israel, and that adds another 2 weeks or so. It is a growing conflict that could also involve other actors, including the United States. There have been reports that the U.S. has warned the Houthis through some mediators against further escalations. So these are important developments that we should watch closely, I believe.
Yeah, I would also agree with everything Mohammad has just said. The attacks really have implications for international shipping, for insurance, for the cost of logistics, especially given the importance of the Bab al-Mandab to global trade. We've already seen the Israeli port in Eilat in the Red Sea really being affected by these attacks. And as Mohammad said, the escalation of attacks from Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen really threatens to bring together the dynamic and volatile politics of the Yemeni conflict with the situation between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And these are two of the most long-running and intractable conflict zones in the Middle East. And they both, of course, have local and regional actors heavily involved. And so if they come closer together, as Mohammad was saying, this could be a very unpredictable new phase of a much wider regional situation.
Okay, thank you both. Mohammad, what do the Houthis stand to gain from getting involved in the Israel-Hamas war? Tell us about their motivations.
It seems that the Houthis have two international and domestic audiences, at least. Internationally, they would like to position themselves as defenders of the Palestinians in this ongoing Israel-Hamas war, and that can help them gain popularity within anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian circles and societies worldwide. Also, domestically, I think by targeting Israel, they think they can enhance their standing among the Yemenis, especially in the areas that are not currently controlled by the Houthis. And that can help them expand their influence and deepen their position and effectively become a de facto state trying to capture the rest of Yemen. But I think there's another element that we need to consider, and that is these operations can also strengthen the Houthis' ties with the so-called Axis of Resistance, which is an alliance that includes Iran and various non-state actors such as Hezbollah, Hamas, and other militant groups in the Middle East. So this collaboration and coordination against Israel could provide the Houthis with critical battlefield experience and also access to more advanced military technology from Iran, which can in turn help them further bolster their military capabilities in the region. Remember, this is a group that became more powerful in the course of a brutal war with the much stronger Saudi Arabia. So they may see opportunities in another round of conflict.
And Kristian, both you and Mohammad mentioned the possibility that these tensions could escalate into a full-fledged conflict. Do you see a full-fledged conflict involving Israel, the US, and other parties actualizing?
Well, as Mohammad said, the Houthis have both domestic and regional calculations to draw upon, one of which also is that since the Houthis really emerged in 2004 as a political and military force, they've consistently used anti-US and anti-Israel rhetoric to try and gain domestic political legitimacy in Yemen. And then since 2014, they've controlled the capital of Yemen and large parts of Yemeni territory. So they have a domestic constituency to try to, I don't think they can afford to just sit on the sidelines, especially at this moment in time. And unlike, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hezbollah is also part of the Axis of Resistance, as Mohammad said, but they do also have to function in a political system where they do share power with other groups, whereas in Houthi-controlled Yemen, there are no domestic political constraints on the Houthis getting involved to the degree that they have. And so I do foresee that there will be a continuing escalation in Houthi attacks, partly because the Houthis are trying to make a point, but also because I think there's far less pushback against the Houthis from regional and also domestic partners should they do so. So I think this is potentially the most likely area of escalation should the conflict in Gaza continue for the foreseeable future.
And how would this affect other actors in the region, including Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think for Saudi Arabia, the concern is that Mohammed bin Salman has these massive giga projects as part of his Vision 2030, which he is trying to complete in the next 6 years. It's been 7 years now since the projects were planned. A lot of those projects are on the Red Sea coast, and they are reliant upon perceptions of Saudi Arabia being safe and secure and stable. And should there be an increase in attacks and constant barrage of missiles and drones raining down on Saudi cities, I think a lot of the potential for progress on those giga projects will be compromised. If people perceive that Saudi Arabia is under attack, then the areas of travel, transportation, hospitality, entertainment, tourism that are the focal point of these projects will be very difficult to achieve.
And as you mentioned briefly before, there's a long history between the Houthis and Saudi. Could this lead to a new round of war?
Well, there's been a ceasefire in Yemen since early 2022, which has largely held, and certainly it's in the Saudis' interest, and they have been very keen to try to draw down the level of violence, partly because I think the Saudis intervened in 2015 thinking they could have a swift military victory. It was called Operation Decisive Storm, and that hasn't happened. So I think the Saudi leadership will be viewing and the possibility of any escalation on their southern border with the Houthis with a great deal of disfavor. And that's why I think we've seen a lot of Saudi-Iranian consultation ever since October the 7th. We've seen telephone calls. We've seen Mohammed bin Salman meeting with Ibrahim Raisi. I think very much an attempt to try to ensure that the conflict in Gaza does not regionalize, does not escalate to include the Gulf once again.
Okay. Mohammad, let's turn to Iran. What is Tehran's role in this?
It's really unclear to what extent Iran is involved in this round of conflict in the Red Sea. And I think we should be careful not to reduce the Houthis to a puppet of Iran. Houthis have their own agency, they have their own interests, they have their own grievances, they have their own calculations. And also the reports that the Houthis did not always listen to Iran's advice, at least in the past. But what we know so far, based on what we hear from the Iranian state-controlled and semi-state-controlled media, is that so far Tehran seems to be content with what is happening in the Red Sea. These statements show strong support from Iran for the Houthis. So it's possible that Iran is at least content with these attacks. There could be several important objectives for Iran here. First of all, Iran would like to counter Israel's pressure on Hamas and also Iran's main ally, Hezbollah in Lebanon, by opening a new front against Israel. The Houthis can potentially disrupt the flow of oil and goods, as I mentioned earlier, to Israel. And their geographic distance from Israel, which is about 1,000 miles, makes it harder for Israel to retaliate and attack the Houthis. So these operations in the Red Sea could divide Israel's forces and attention and basically provide more breathing space for Hamas, also provide some level of protection, if you will, for Hezbollah. And this brings me to perhaps the most important point that I would like to make, and that is, as a result of these operations in the Red Sea, I think the Houthis could emerge as a major strategic asset to Iran, far more important than they have been in the past. And I would go as far as saying, in a way, it could be even comparable to Hezbollah and perhaps even more consequential than Hezbollah for Iran for various reasons. The Houthis, of course, are not as ideologically united with Iran as the Shiite Hezbollah is. But unlike Hezbollah, as Kristian was saying earlier, the Houthis are the dominant political and military force in Yemen's capital, Sana'a, and they can eventually become a de facto state actor. Also, Yemen's location near the Strait of Bab al-Mandab makes it strategically and geographically far more important than Lebanon. By controlling this choke point, the Houthis can have the ability to control global trade and become a significant player on the international stage. And remember, Israel in the past attacked ships that were carrying Iranian oil in the Red Sea. So Iran now can signal new capabilities to retaliate against Israel and US sanctions through the Houthis. And this can continue long after the current Israel-Hamas war ends. So this is a long-term challenge.
And I know you said it's important not to think about the Houthis as Iran's puppet, but can you say a little bit more about their relationship? And you insinuated that Tehran probably views the Houthis' operations in the Red Sea as a positive development. Can you say a bit more about that?
Sure. So ideologically, the Houthis are not aligned with Iran the way Hezbollah is, as I mentioned. The Houthis, we often hear in the media, the Shia-backed or Iran-backed the Houthis, but they're not part of the mainstream 12 Shiites, if you will. They believe in the 4 Imams, and then they go through a different lineage. Whereas Iran and Hezbollah, they believe in the mainstream 12 Imams that most Shiites believe. So ideologically, they are very, very different. And they had some ties. Remember, the Houthis' grievances are old. They predate the Islamic Republic. They predate the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The Saudis went into Yemen claiming that they were disrupting the Iran-Houthi alliance. But in fact, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. By going into Yemen, by bombing Yemen, yes, the Iranians, the Houthis had some level of coordination, ties, communications. Iran was providing some level of support to the Houthis, but not to the extent that we saw by 2021 or 2022 when the conflict came to a halt. So the two are very, very close. And also remember, Yemen is a big country, has a population of 20 million or so. Having a big country as a major ally of Iran, again, the Houthis are not controlling all of Yemen, but still controlling a significant portion of Yemen. As I said, they're strategically located in the Strait of Bab al-Mandab. So they could be a very important ally, and Iranians are very well aware of it, and they talk about it and they mention it. And they're pleasantly surprised that this ally suddenly fell on their lap, if you will. The Houthis have their own interests. There were reports that several years ago when the Houthis were going into Sana'a to capture Sana'a, there were reports that Iran actually advised them against going into Sana'a, and yet the Houthis did not listen. Yet Iran remained strongly supportive of them.
Would the recent rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia be at risk from an escalatory cycle that draws the Houthis into a regional conflict?
So this is another important element to think about. Yes, this conflict could potentially jeopardize this rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia that was mediated by Chinese. But as Kristian said, this is a very important agreement for the Saudis for economic reasons. It's also an important agreement to the Iranians for various security and diplomatic reasons. So as long as the Saudis don't offer a platform to Israel or the US against the Houthis or Iran, I think the conflict may not threaten the Saudi-Iran deal. But at the same time, it's a fragile agreement that could unravel by external factors. So we have to see.
Okay, Kristian, final question. Can you explain the implications for the US, for Saudi Arabia, and for other Gulf states such as the United Arab Emirates of this potential escalation?
Yes, so since 2021, we've seen a real push in the Gulf, especially to dial down some of the escalation that we'd seen over the previous decade, to really try to have a mood of rapprochement and reconciliation, partly because there had been no real winners of the decade of confrontation that followed the Arab Spring and the geopolitical and sectarian conflicts that ensued. And I think this could put it all at risk. And in the UAE, for example, they had 3 missile and drone attacks from the Houthis to Abu Dhabi in 2022, which caused shockwaves. We've seen Saudis being hit for many years. And there's no desire, I think, in Riyadh or in Abu Dhabi or any other Gulf capitals for a return to that situation up until 2020, when there was real tension, real threat of potential escalation. And from a Saudi point of view, they remember the attacks on their oil facilities in 2019, which temporarily knocked out about half of Saudi Arabia's oil production. And so we've seen moves since 2021 to try to patch up and repair differences. And the risk for the Houthi issue is that this could put that all in jeopardy. And as Mohammad said, we've seen the Saudis and Iranians, we've seen the UAE and the Iranians talking at high levels, the highest levels, in fact, to try to make sure this doesn't happen. I think from a US perspective, the concern is that the situation in Gaza is now so volatile that if there's now a potential interconnection with the situation in Yemen with the Houthis, that really adds another layer of unpredictability and another kind of escalatory pathway to what is already a tinderbox. So I think that would be the concern going forward.
Okay, thank you so much, Mohammad and Kristian, for your insight. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the team at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. This episode was produced by Victoria Jupe and Shannon Moriarty. AV production was conducted by Kevin Young. The Baker Institute for Public Policy provides meaningful policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the US, and the world. To learn more, including how you can attend a live podcast recording, visit us at bakerinstitute.org. Thank you for listening.